Okay, preparing for a virtual meeting. Here's, in general, I leave myself about twice as much time to prepare for a meeting as I do for the actual meeting. So if you're preparing for a 3-hour meeting, um, personally, I like to think of it as 6 hours of prep time. That's for complex meetings, not for recurring team meetings. So here we go. Very simple way to think about what needs to be done to prepare for a meeting is the 5 W's. So who, what, when, where, and why. So who needs to be there, who's been invited, who's been confirmed. You might think about who's essential for the meeting or not essential, who is your core team, etc., etc. What are you meeting about? So in other words, you need a clear agenda. When are you meeting? So setting a time and date that works for everyone. Where are you meeting? In this case, it'll obviously be on a Zoom platform. And why are you meeting? So this gets at the clear purpose, or what I call objectives, that then shape your agenda. So let's just dive in a little bit more in detail. So who will be there? This is actually more important than in virtual meetings. Everything is a little bit harder to wing or just sort of do by the seat of your pants when you're online. So I, especially as somebody who's external to most of the meetings that I facilitate, I generally I need a list of participants ahead of time. And that can include who's been confirmed, what language, if they have any language requirements, and whether or not they have tech. So if we can expect them to call in, or if we think that they're going to be coming in online. Especially again in remote communities, when you're dealing with people who may not be able to see what everybody else is seeing, it's important to know this ahead of time so you can adjust your expectations and your activities to fit the group. When I prepare that list, I know it sounds silly, but I order it in alphabetical order because I'll get into this in a second. But when I do circles with people, I like to do it by alphabetical order, and I like to have that all figured out ahead of time. So the same for if you're using breakout groups. I tend to organize those ahead of time. Very difficult because there's always some changes in who shows up and who doesn't, but you want to have that more or less figured out ahead of time. And then I also list those breakout group names by alphabetical order so that it's just all clear and easy. The other part of the who question is who's on your core team. As I mentioned before, I recommend having a minimum of 2 people as part of this core team. So the first one being your facilitator, of course. It's very, very much the same role as in regular meetings. Note taker, highly undervalued skill and role, but very, very important to the success and ongoing success of your meetings and whatever group you're facilitating. I often think of a host, again, as a person who's often on the outside of the communities that I'm facilitating for. I tend to like to have a host do openings and closings and reflections and welcoming and all that kind of thing that allows people to feel connected to the meeting. It's nice to have someone whose role is to facilitate the chat. Again, depending on the group, I've had groups who have these long and very elaborate chats going on the side. You can have that person, the facilitator of the chat, putting in questions or sharing things as the presenter is presenting. They answer participants' questions, and they can even do some tech support. Another thing that's important is often people use the chat to ask questions to presenters. As a facilitator, I very much appreciate when that person who's keeping an eye on chat lets me know, because you're doing so many things as a facilitator, that chat kind of supervisor, if you will, can say, oh, there's been a question from Tom about X, Y, or Z. Obviously, you need a tech person. Tech people are responsible for the tech, so they generally need to be someone who's a clear communicator more than a real expert. As you can see, Zoom is not that complicated, but you just need someone sometimes to hold people's hand and walk them through the steps to get on to the meeting. This is the person's number. You'll want to share this person's number with participants ahead of time. So in case of difficulty, please call, right, in the email or whatever. And it's good for that person to think through kind of a backup plan. If all goes sideways, maybe you want to, if internet goes down often in your communities, then maybe you want to also share a teleconference line and tell people that if, Zoom doesn't work by 12:15 or something, then we're going to all switch to the teleconference line or something like that. Anyway, figure out a good backup plan that works for you. This tech person will also help set up the breakout groups, polls, and all that kind of thing that you'll want to do ahead of time, but also, a lot of it happens during the meeting. If you're having a larger meeting, and again, we'll get into this in a little bit more detail in the next workshop, but you will want to have co-facilitators or facilitators of the breakout rooms, depending on the complexity of the task that you've assigned. So, as I mentioned, depending on the size and complexity of the meeting, you'll probably want to have one or even a few pre-meetings with all the members of your core team. This will just allow you to get comfortable with the technology, to test, if you've never used breakout rooms before, make sure you have 4 people on the line and you can put the breakout rooms into place, break them up again, right? Just go through all of those motions that will help you feel comfortable when the meeting day finally comes. Rule of thumb, I can't stress this enough, core team members have to be online 15 to 30 minutes ahead of time. Don't skimp on that for any reason. You will set yourself up for difficulties, I promise you. I would say that core team in that case also includes the translator. Translators or anybody who's playing any role in the meeting needs to be online half an hour ahead of time. Developing a long agenda, I'm going to show this to you in a second, but the core team needs to be named and all of their roles that they're playing need to be named right in that long agenda. And you can even get that core team involved in developing the agenda because they'll look at it a little differently than you will. And you'll want to figure out who needs what permissions on Zoom I'm talking about in particular, right? Because you will show that to you in a second, but you can make people into a co-host or a presenter, and that allows them different functions in the meeting. So that's all stuff you want to test out in that preparation meeting with your core team. So there are 3 options, as I keep mentioning. You can either join online, you can phone in and just use the phone line to hear, or there's this sort of hybrid version, which I've seen a lot of people in remote areas use, which is that they log on their computer, but they also call in on the phone. So this is a great hybrid version for people who have slow internet, right? And I think, as I mentioned before, it's important to know your participants, right? So if you can assess ahead of time who has access to what, then do that, so that maybe nobody has access to internet in your community. So a teleconference call is what you need to do, right? The other option I've started to explore with different groups throughout the pandemic is that, in some regions, they're still allowed to gather, right, in groups of 10, 20, 30 people. So if that's the case, maybe there's some of you who get together in person with one computer to connect with others who are in maybe different communities where you can't gather, right? So you can get creative about combining Zoom with in-person meetings, or and just play with your options. So as I said, part of the preparation is getting the back end of Zoom figured out, which we just went through in a lot of detail. Do mock meetings, as I mentioned, with your core team. And really just think through every detail of the agenda. This is really the time to brush and comb and think about, where the breakout rooms, who's setting up the breakout rooms, who's able to share a screen and not share a screen, are we recording or not recording, and all of those things that you need to think through ahead of time. Communicating with participants, very, very important ahead of the meeting. You want to know who's going to be doing that communicating and what is the best way to reach them. It's not always email, right? I think a lot of us who are professionals go straight for email, but figure out what's best for your community. It might be Facebook, it might be a phone call, right? for those of you who work in communities where the elders still speak their language, you need to leave some time for translation. Always, I can't tell you how many times I've been caught with not enough time to get that done. Very, very important to make it accessible. Provide all documents by email or even by snail mail, right? Again, judging by your own needs and the needs of your community. This is an important part of ensuring that people can join no matter what their tech capacity, okay? So all the documents for a meeting, it's very standard, send out the agenda and anything you're going to be referring to during the meeting. But I would also include in this all of your slides, right? So oftentimes in online meetings, we have presentations or even just sort of information slides. These can all be shared ahead of time. The trick is to number the slides. And if you're translating, make sure that they're numbered the exact same in English as in the second language, so that people we can say, okay, we're turning to slide number 5, and everybody is like on the same page, right? If you're sharing documents, these file names should be numbered in the file name itself. So, document 1 for agenda item number 1 or whatever it is. And you can even change the name of the file to be exactly the same as the title in the agenda. This just helps people to orient if they're not going to have a shared screen with all the information up in front of them. If they're just on the phone, at least they can follow through with your meeting with the documents provided that you've been sent ahead of time by email or through the mail. And as I said again, in some communities, what people are doing right now is they're sending all this stuff by email and then calling the person and saying, hey, I sent you an email yesterday. Can we have a look at it together? And going through and making sure they've downloaded them. They're able to open them. They know where the agenda is. They know that there's a bunch of corresponding documents. Maybe they want to print them, right? So that personal touch of communicating can really help those with tech challenges or to be part of these meetings. Grandchildren or children are also very helpful. So eliciting their help to ensure that their family members can get on meetings is also a good technique. Keep it clear, 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 clear. So you're telling people to get onto this new platform. They've maybe have never heard of Zoom. They've maybe never been on a web platform. Just keep it as simple as possible. Use images. If you have to translate it, ideally it's getting translated by somebody who knows Zoom already. And then you provide clear options. So in the emails I send out, I say, if you have internet connection, then you're going to click this link. If you don't have internet connection, then you're going to call this phone number, right? If you need help, please call Ben at, and you provide the phone number, right? So the goal is really with any ahead of time communication about the technology in particular, you want to keep it as simple as possible. The priority is really to get them online. The rest can wait. You can do all that Zoom orientation that we did at the beginning once they're online. But the priority really has to stay on getting them into the meeting so that you can talk and get your work done. So the next step in all of this is generating an agenda for participants. That's a huge part of the preparing. So we're not going to talk in great detail about what agendas look like. I'm going to assume that everybody is well acquainted with agendas at this point and how to generate them. But there's really nothing unique about a virtual agenda. It look the same as any other in-person meeting agenda. Just a little tip though, I tend to like to, in the agenda item, indicate if it's a discussion item, an information sharing item, or you're going to be seeking some kind of decision. Just helps people to know what you're going to do with that block. As I mentioned before, allowing time for tech support depending on the group at the beginning of the meeting. Just work that in so you don't feel rushed. And use the same structure as you would for in-person meetings. So here are a few exceptions, okay? So as I mentioned before, you want to do that sort of tech training or orientation as part of the, that opening section. So just covering etiquette, things like how to use the mute button and so on. This can be done in 5 minutes. It doesn't have to be elaborate, right? Just so everybody feels comfortable. Go-around introductions are very, very important. It's not just, when you're in an in-person meeting, doing a go-around, especially for a group that maybe already knows each other and knows each other's names, feels a bit redundant. In the context of a virtual meeting, this allows you to test whether people know how to mute and unmute themselves, and whether you can hear them when they do try and speak, right? So these are important things to know as you're going into your meeting. So maybe they need a little bit of tech support to figure out how to get their mic working or something. That can be dealt with by your tech support person while the rest of the go-arounds are happening, right? You want to sort this all out at the beginning and not when you're in the middle of a discussion. I like to use icebreakers, again, as a way to help people get comfortable on the tech, as much as for breaking the ice, right? So I tend to do a quick exercise that practices using the chat box. I'll show that to you in a second. You can use breakout rooms if you're going to be using them later on, and a Jamboard to just address a fun, quick question. But again, it's just a way to get people using the tech and comfortable with the tech before you're diving into the content of your meeting, right? Another exception in online meeting environments is that I tend to do shorter breaks. So in-person meetings, we can sometimes do breaks that are 15, 20 minutes, sometimes even half an hour. But online, you're at home, you just need to give people enough time to get a tea and go to the washroom or whatever. So 5 to 10 minutes is plenty. Again, this is kind of standard practice in some circles, but I would strongly, strongly suggest that you ask folks for feedback on the technology at the end. You might be surprised how people feel. You want to get some tips for next time. This is all part of a learning journey for all of us. So leave some time either through chat or a survey or something so that people can give you some feedback. So the long agenda. This is, again, for more complicated meetings, this is essential. For shorter kind of core team meetings, this might not be as essential, but the long agenda is what I consider, it's a detailed agenda, and it's really for core team members. So in there, you'll have your meeting objectives, all the sort of details you would in a normal agenda. I like to include outcomes. So what are you trying to accomplish with that piece of the agenda? And then a fourth column for who's doing what behind the scenes, okay? So Tom is putting people into breakout groups, Suzanne is monitoring the chat, and Amanda's facilitating, right? So that kind of thing is really, again, that's where you capture all those details that you work through in your pre-meetings to get prepared. You want that agenda to include links to all the pieces that you're going to be using. So if you're using Google Docs or Jamboards or any of those sort of fancy tools, you want to have those links there. So this is like your one-stop shop for the meeting, basically. You want to have as much detail as possible. I am a big fan of Google Drive. We'll get into that a little bit more later, only because, especially with something like this long agenda, it's going to evolve a lot, right? And it's just easier than keeping track of a million different versions. As I said before, it may not be necessary for small groups or working groups that meet regularly, but just wanted to introduce that idea. So here's an example of a long agenda for Zoom meetings. This is, so as you can see here, I've actually scheduled right in the agenda when we expect the core team to join online. So it's half an hour ahead of time. At noon, we're doing the welcome and opening prayer, an official welcome, and you can see how much detail. It's right down to the minute who's doing what. It's not to say that I'm constantly, as the facilitator, looking at my watch, but it's just a way of thinking through and being really clear about who's doing what and how long they have. You can see here in the outcomes, right, I've been clear that this part of what we're doing here is getting people comfortable on Zoom and making sure everyone's clear on the purpose. So outcomes help you to keep really focused on why you're doing this agenda item and what you hope comes out at the other end. Trust me, it's a great tool. And then as you see here in the final column, the fourth column, you see concurrent logistics. This team that I worked with was great at doing these details here. But as you can see, we've gone right down to who is screen sharing, what file, who's looking after the chat. They've even written out the script ahead of time of what they're going to paste into the chat box. And then Tatiana is going to be launching this Zoom poll, while Amanda, as you see in the column 2, is actually doing the explaining. So it's all choreographed. Maybe that's a good word to use for this. I think I mentioned before this great feature of Zoom to have simultaneous translation. I'm not going to go into great detail here, but it's really, like, when I discovered this, I was just blown away by how easy it was. Again, the only caveat in this is that it's, as far as I know to date, and maybe Zoom is working on this as we speak, I hope they are, is that there's no option for phone-based translation. So a bit of a challenge for the rural and remote folks. If you're interested in exploring more, as I mentioned, Zoom has some incredible support online, some videos that'll walk you through really how to do this. So that's how I learned, and I recommend you do the same, because it's quite, we're getting into the real nitty-gritties here. So just quickly, some other technology that I use and that I think is really valuable for making engaging participatory online meetings is using Google Drive. Honestly, I'll show it to you in a second, but it's really one of my best used tools for this remote work. You can use it to harvest from workshops. Again, I'll show that to you in just a second. You can invite people. You can invite people into that space, a little bit like the Jamboard, so everybody is working in the same space. It's a great way to allow you to, if you have heavy files, like let's say you're having a huge meeting and you have like a bunch of PDFs and your PowerPoints got really big, this is a way to prevent, filling people's bandwidth up. You just send them a link to the PowerPoint and they can look at it all online. They don't have to download it, right? So also a good consideration for rural and remote folks. The way I'm going to show this to you in a second, but I often set up worksheets in Google Drive before I learned about Jamboard anyway, and then I duplicate each of the worksheets so that each breakout group has the same worksheet. So we're working off the same questions with the same instructions, but just in a different breakout room. Again, I'll show that to you in a second. Google Classroom, I've just become familiar with, is a great sort of one-stop shop for everything you need to know. Again, I'm not going to introduce you to this here today, but very useful, especially if you're meeting on a repeated basis with a working group or some group that wants to start accumulating files and resources and stuff like that, and just have one place to go to find everything. I mentioned Jamboard. Mural is very similar to Jamboard. Other things include Google Forms, Zoom polls, or Survey Monkeys. These are all ways of online tools that you can use to set up some feedback loops. So what did you think of the meeting today? What would you recommend we do differently? These, people can just type in their answers into these forms. And there's others, of course. There's a plethora, but I think this is the basic package that I use for my participatory online meetings. So Google Drive, I think I already mentioned. I'm just going to flip over now to show you how I use Google Drive. So this is a worksheet that I set up in Google Drive. Again, I'm not going to show you all the ins and outs of it, but just wanted to show you how great this can be. So this was set up, there was 2 working groups in this meeting. They each got the exact same sheet, but in 2 different places. So the small group facilitator had the instructions right there, right? Focusing on the 5 thematic areas. Please share your thoughts about, right? And then she was typing the answers in as people were talking, right? Through a shared screen on Zoom. Again, it's very hard to show without being on Zoom. So there's two options for using Google Docs. Either you can invite everybody in to the Google Doc by sharing the link, just like we did with Jamboard. So you copy the link and then you paste it into the chat box in Zoom, and then everybody can come and type their own answers in while you're talking. Or the other option is just the co-facilitator has this open, and they share their screen through Zoom. And then everybody will see this, and just like, you know, if you have a facilitator standing up at the front of the room writing on a whiteboard or on a flip chart, it's the same idea, but just a virtual format. So another fun option with Zoom that you'll need to set up ahead of time is the polling function. So Zoom allows you to use up to 3 polls with multiple questions each during a meeting. So really fun way to get people kind of engaged and giving you feedback on what you're up to. So to do this, you need to first schedule your meeting. Okay, it has to be scheduled in order for you to add a poll. Once you've scheduled your meeting, you can go to your online portal, and I'm just going to show you how to do that in a second in some detail. And then, so just quickly then before we do that, why use polls? So it gives you quick feedback from a group. It can help you make a decision if you're using a voting system, really depends. Keeps people engaged, and it's just a fun way to break the ice, especially with a larger group. So let's have a look then at what this looks like online. So setting up a poll on Zoom. So again, I'm logged in, so I'm to my zoom.us, and I'm going to go to my account. So in here on the left, you'll see under profile that I have some meetings. So I'm just going to go into this Real Online workshop meeting to show you how to do this. So I just clicked on the title, and it comes up with all these details that you know can either play with or not, but generally you should already have these already set up. But if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, it's kind of hidden. I don't know why they hide it so well, but it's in this little box at the bottom. It says, you have not created any poll yet. So what you want to do is add a poll, even though it doesn't look like that's what you're doing with those buttons. So let's call this poll 1. You can choose whether it's anonymous or not. Did you like using Zoom today? Okay, so the only types of questions you can ask using the poll is either a single choice, so they'll only be given one choice, or multiple choice, i.e. they can choose different answers. So let's just say that for this question you just want to give them one choice. Yes, a lot. Yes, it was okay. Not sure, right? No, it was bumpy. No, never want to do it again, right? Hopefully nobody chooses. Okay, so it's very simple. You just set it up like that. And then as you can see here, for this poll, you could add another question. So that means that all of these questions would pop up at the same time. So there's your second question option, right? And then you save it. Maybe I need to delete this question first. There we go, save. And then there it is. We've created poll 1, okay? And then you can either go back in and edit it or delete it if you think that you did a really bad job and need to start over again. So this poll will now be available for you to launch once you've started your meeting in Zoom, okay? So that is the only way to do polling on Zoom that I know of anyway. Maybe there's others. So next, we're going to talk about some tips and tricks for during a virtual meeting. So you've already done all the setup, and now you're jumping into the actual meeting. So how do you set up your meetings? Again, part of this is prep, I guess. Part of it is how you run your meeting. So circles. A lot of you will be very acquainted with circles because it's a very well-known method for running meetings in many Indigenous communities. It's really a technique for ensuring that everyone has a chance to speak and express themselves. And in-person meetings, obviously, these are literally set up as circles in the room. You might have a feather or a stick or something that people pass around, and you say only the person with the stick or the feather is allowed to speak. And the idea being that everybody takes their turn in a predetermined order to speak. The only rules really are that you can only speak when it's your turn, and when it is your turn, you can pass. You're not obligated to speak. So I use these a lot in meetings, and I think they're very, very important way of making sure that everybody's voice is heard. So you want to, why do an opening circle in particular? So at the very beginning of the meeting, I think this is an important way to get everyone's voice in the room. They may never have spoken through Zoom before, so it's important to just say, please introduce yourself and where you live, or whatever questions it is that you want to ask folks. It also helps you to make sure that everyone knows how to mute and unmute themselves, right? And that there's no tech barriers to speaking, as we mentioned before. And it will establish a speaking order. So first thing in the meeting, you do an opening circle, you write it down, or maybe you've already made your list in alphabetical order. And you will use that over and over throughout the meeting. So as a facilitator, you decide what the order is. It can be random, maybe it's the order in which people have showed up at the meeting and you wrote their name down. I'm a fan of alphabetical, just because then everybody can see what the order is and predict when it's their turn. Sometimes I do it by region. I can go from east to west or north to south. You could even do it by age, right? You can play with how you set up that order. And as I said, I write down this order on a piece of paper that I keep beside me throughout the meeting, so that I can refer to that list over and over again. And of course, just tell the group that this is how things are going to run each time, and that way they know and they become more familiar with it each time you run through that circle. So opening circles I tend to keep for groups that are less than 15, more or less. If you try and do this with much more than 15 people, you run the risk of really taking over too much of your meeting with introductions. So you want to, especially if it's a new group or groups that don't work together very often, you want to make sure that people introduce themselves. This is generally how I set it up. Take 1 minute, tell us about what your name is, what you do, your organization, and one principle or guideline that you propose to ensure we have a good meeting. Alternatively, if this is a group of people that is well established or works together often, you can use this opening circle to do a check-in. I know some people find this a bit touchy-feely, but I think especially in the context that we're in right now, where we are mostly meeting virtually, this is a really important time for folks to connect on that personal level, right? We're not just workers, we're also people, and we have personal relationships. So this is a chance to build relationships that I think are really fundamental to the work that we do. So this is a chance for me to say, you know what, my kids were up all night last night, I barely slept, or I got some great news from my mother-in-law, she had an operation, she's doing great, that personal stuff that in an office setting or work environment, you might just share while you're getting a coffee in the kitchen. This is a chance to just do that. It's important. Even if time is short, you can make it one word or one sentence or something really simple so that people don't feel like it's wasting time. As you noticed, one of the questions I tend to ask groups, especially if it's a group that's going to work together or does work together regularly, is to establish these guidelines or principles as part of the meeting. It's very important because it establishes a collective agreement about what's acceptable and not acceptable. And then as a facilitator, that gives me some legitimacy to uphold that group's agreement. Often groups will say, let's be respectful and not cut each other off. Okay, so then if somebody cuts another person off, I can say, please, thank you, we agreed that we weren't going to cut each other off, so thanks for just giving this person the time to finish. It helps to create a group culture that can reinforce participation and respectful dialogue. Very important as you're building your group. Something to spend some time thinking about, I would recommend. And it can really help you set a group intention, like I think in a lot of the work that we do, we're trying to change things, right? We're trying to move from a colonial past into a healing future where things are done differently. And so what does that differently look like? How do we meet together differently so that we are changing the patterns of the past and not recreating them? Once these guidelines are established, you can review them. Sometimes with some groups, I read them out or have someone read them out at the beginning of each meeting just to remind ourselves. Maybe you want to, revise them once a year or something like that. But again, I think these are particularly important when you've got a diversity of people around the table from different backgrounds, especially Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks who may have different rules or expectations of how we act in meetings together. So icebreakers is another thing that I like to do. It's important. It's light, easy. It can take 2 minutes. As I mentioned before, I like to get people using the chat with their icebreaker so that they can feel comfortable using it throughout the meeting. So here's a quick example of one that I use in the chat box. Complete the following sentence, and then I just put up one at a time. If only I could. And then I say to folks, okay, so complete the sentence in the chat box, and on my account, we're gonna all press return and poster, right? And then you can see what everybody said, and it can be fun. It's just a fun little thing. And other icebreakers I use is one of the silver linings of this COVID era that I've noticed is, so I like to get people thinking about the positive sides of things. And in my wildest dreams, I never thought that. So you can make up your own. You're welcome to use these ones. I stole these from other facilitators. So yeah, get people using the chat box during the icebreaker. Table setting. This is the sort of the opening presentations. I call those table settings. So the opening prayer, the welcome, this is why we're here, review the agenda, all that kind of stuff. It's in table setting. We talked about Zoom orientation. But even bigger than the actual particulars of Zoom is you want to just sort of, especially if it's a group that's not familiar with Zoom, just frame this as a fun new experiment in meeting, right? Make sure to say that, we're all learning. Nobody's got this down pat. There's probably going to be some hiccups with the technology, and that just helps people to be a little bit more patient with you too as a facilitator as you're learning. Humor is always great. Let people know that it's okay if their kids are wailing in the background, or need to pop off the call to deal with something, the delivery or the tree that's fallen on their house or whatever. All kinds of life happens, right? And of course that comes through when we're meeting from home. As I mentioned before, encourage people to press buttons and try things on Zoom. They can't break it. And just a review of some of the things I like to do with people early on in the meeting and that table setting part of the agenda, getting them to mute and unmute themselves with a round of introductions, renaming themselves, hiding their self-view, looking at different gallery views versus presenter views, using the chat, right? Get people using the technology as part of that early part of the meeting. So breakout groups, I can't emphasize enough how important these are to having a good conversation in a virtual setting. We all know that there's always people in groups that are more comfortable and less comfortable speaking in front of a large group of people. For whatever reason, that's accentuated online. So putting people into groups of 4 or 5 people is much less intimidating. And I've had almost every group that does a Zoom breakout group for the first time, I get just amazing comments back saying how fantastic it was. They had a great conversation, how nice it was to connect with others. Because a lot of us are working from home. We don't have a chance to have really good conversations with people that are not really close to us right now. So it provides, again, some of that networking and social side of meetings that otherwise is missed with, these bigger virtual meetings. So some of the tips, so I showed you how to turn that on in Zoom in the back end on the website, zoom.us, before being able to use it in a meeting. But just some of the tips, I tend to use, if you're using repeated breakout groups, like one in the opening circle, for example, maybe with a bigger group, you might use that. I use the same breakout groups throughout the meeting if you're doing multiple breakout groups. And as I said before, it's important to prepare well ahead of time so that your co-facilitators know exactly what they're doing. They have the links to the worksheets or the Jamboards or whatever it is that you're using to support those conversations. I had some questions from the workshop group when I did this the first time about how to keep energy and engagement up. I think, that's been woven throughout the meeting, as I said, using all of these, the polls, the breakout groups, the chats, the reactions, mixing up the formats. These are all good ways to keep the energy and engagement up during your meeting. One more thing is I sometimes invite people literally just to stand up in front of their desk and do some stretching, or maybe you want to put some music on and do some dancing, or, invite people to move. And of course, to participate and be a part of the conversation. I think I already mentioned that I would strongly recommend never going over 3 or 4 hours for virtual online meetings. Participation. So make it fun to participate, build people up to feel comfortable with the technology, use circles, encourage people to use alternative forms of participation. So if they're not comfortable even in small groups talking, they're welcome to share their ideas through chat or reactions. And where possible, ask people to be together in their community for their meetings, right? We mentioned this as well. So these are all ways to help people participate more. I'm just going to touch lightly on decision making because this is, I could do a whole workshop just on decision making. But during meetings, I think it's really important for groups, especially that are working together, to have very, very clear agreement about how they make decisions together. So do you use consensus or is it majority vote? If it's majority vote, is it 50 plus 1? Is it 70 plus 1? What's your line? And then in the agenda items, it's important to really make a clear distinction about, are you trying to make a decision in that agenda item? Are you trying to come up with a recommendation for another group in that agenda item? So yeah, what is a decision for your group? And then, of course, use circles to hear from everyone. And then when you're moving to a decision, generate a clear proposal, right? Again, all this is just even more important in an online environment. And then you repeat the proposal at least 3 times. I like to get it up as a visual on a shared screen or something so that everyone can see it and really think properly about it. And then if you're using consensus, which is generally what I use in my meetings, and most of the groups I work with prefer consensus. If it's a light decision, I tend to just ask if anyone disagrees with the proposal. So I'll put the proposal out and say, does anyone disagree? Please feel free to disagree. We welcome your disagreement. And then just leave a pause. Leave people time to disagree. That's very important. If it's a bigger decision and you really want to make sure that everyone has a chance to voice their opinion, you can do a circle and ask if they agree or disagree. You can use these 5 levels of consensus if you want to get into a bit more detail. You can also use, if everyone's on video, you can ask people to use the thumbs up or the thumbs down. But I have yet to have a group where there was no one on the phone, so I don't tend to use that one. Other little random tips and tricks during breaks, remind people not to log off, right? Because then you just end up having a whole other slew of tech challenges to deal with when people are coming back. I tend to ask people on breaks just to turn off their camera and their audio. And then when we come back from the break, I say, okay, we're back. Can you just turn on your camera so I know you're back? And it just sort of gives that sense of, okay, we're all back. Having your core team needs to have a way to communicate that's not verbal. So there's all kinds of ways to do this. You can set up a Slack channel. Maybe with a smaller group, you might use a text messaging. But you need some way to say, whoops, this is going way over. What do we cut? Or don't forget, or whoops, you forgot to do the poll. Do you mind if we do it at the end instead, or something, just those little things that happen during meetings that you're going to need to talk about. Expect to have technological hiccups and just be prepared to deal with it. It's not a big deal. Nobody expects you to be perfect. It's better to expect that you'll have some challenges ahead of time. There's this option to record, as I mentioned, so you just need to be clear about getting people's consent for recording and be clear about what you're going to do with that recording. And as I mentioned several times, evaluate how it went. Ask the group to use the chat or use a poll or something to see what they thought about this virtual meeting. And then if you're doing a more elaborate evaluation, I like to leave time during the meeting for people to fill out those questions. Otherwise, your response rate will go way down. So that wraps up this section of the webinar. And last but not least, we have some of the things to do after the meeting. So, we're all learning about these new ways of meeting. So you need to support team learning. So this is your core team, right? So every time I do, especially a big or complex meeting, I ask everybody on the core team to stay on for 15 to 20 minutes after the meeting so that we can debrief right away. How did it go? What did you think? What would you do differently next time? Write this stuff down. This is gold, right? This is all part of your ongoing learning. And then other than that, there's the usual meeting follow-up applies, right? Follow up with the participants, thank yous, what's next, here are the resources that were shared, and of course share a copy of the minutes or reports or whatever results from the meeting. So that's really the light touch after the meeting, right? Not too complicated, nothing very unique to meeting online. I would just mention that the, one of the great things is like Jamboards or Google Documents or anything that you use in your small group breakouts. That becomes a great harvest. So you want to download those and make sure you keep a copy of them after the meeting so that you don't lose any of that material. But great way to capture meeting content without having mad note takers in all the breakout groups. So maybe a great thing to add to this list would be to file all the outcomes from your meetings properly so you can refer to them later. So just a reminder for those of you who are with RILN and maybe watching this all the way to the end, there are 2 other workshops. I encourage you to get in touch with Stephanie or Megan about signing up for these additional workshops. Thank you so much, and it's been a pleasure to share all of this with you. If you have any questions, you're welcome to contact me at sheedyconsulting@gmail.com. Thanks again.